All right, so today we're going to break down a new bill coming into the landscape, coming over from the Republicans. We'll go through the bill itself, give you some ideas of how this might implement into the overall architecture of bills that are actually hitting the House, and then how that might affect you guys out there within the crypto markets, all that good stuff. My name is Paul Barrow. Welcome back into TechPath. All right, before we get started, I wanted to kind of frame this up a little bit in the sense that there are bills in the House right now that are fairly significant that most likely will have a good chance of getting some traction. And we'll go through those a little bit, but there is one new bill that is making its way in called F.I.T. And I'll explain this. We'll break down a very, very long bill itself, just to give you guys a heads up on this. But we're going to shorten this into just the things that matter. So if you're really curious about how this works for affecting crypto assets, and more importantly, how this might affect financial systems in general, banks, etc., are all applied into this bill. So here it was coming in from Bloomberg. Crypto bill is possible, says key Republican after the Ripple ruling. Glenn Thompson, of course, is one of the authors of this bill. House lawmaker says he's optimistic that the recent court ruling, widely seen as limiting U.S. Securities Exchange Commission power, will bolster up support for crypto legislation that he's been championing. And of course, the Ripple decision, as we know, has highlighted what we've been saying all along. There's confusion. Now there will be some digital assets that are treated under the securities law. I think this is going to be important because I feel like this is a period of time in which it's likely that regulation might actually come around before we see any kind of legal action coming back at the ruling and the decision out of the Ripple case, meaning maybe no scenarios where the SEC comes back in and tries to file against that. Again, the likelihood is that we could see regulation before that, which would give us clarity and obviously change things for what we're going to be dealing with the SEC and who's in charge of this. So let's break it down. A couple of things I want to jump to. This was the myth versus fact. All digital assets other than Bitcoin are securities and should be regulated by Securities Exchange Commission. That's the kind of the myth thing. The decision called into question the SEC position that practically all digital assets are securities. That's a good thing. The SEC's policy was rejected by the court, which highlights the need for legislation. Digital assets that have been recognized by non-security digital assets or digital commodities account for about 70% of the market. This is a pretty significant number that I did not realize. Another myth, existing legal frameworks can accommodate digital assets. This is something we've argued here on this channel, is that, the Howey test and the 1930s Security Act just doesn't, really play into this, especially for this new one, which they're proposing as the 21st Century Act. So what they're simply saying here, guys, is that they're not taking anything away from the SEC if a digital asset does meet the test that would basically require it to be an investment contract of any kind. And we'll talk about that in the bill itself. This is the joint rulemaking section that is in there. The oversight of the duly registered exchanges and oversight of mixed digital asset transactions. This is basically section 104 that prohibits the CFTC and the SEC from making any rule limiting self-custody of an individual. That's pretty significant and good. Another point that they made to notice of intent to register for the CFTC intermediaries. This is important because it will change how fighting notices are done. They basically provide the flyer with limited relief from certain security enforcement actions until such time the rules are written and permanent registration commences. International harmonization requires the CFTC and the SEC to work together with foreign regulators to establish consistent international standards for digital asset markets. That'll be interesting if that applies to MiCA in Hong Kong and what's been happening already ahead of them. Implementation, this effective date, this requires the CFTC and the SEC to do all of this no later than 360 days, 1 year, after the enactment of the act. Now, further into Section 201, it says it establishes an exemption from the securities laws for digital asset issuers' sale of digital assets. So the purchaser, this is important because it changes up the dynamic of how seed stage investing works. And basically what it does is it eliminates the ability for early and seed and VCs and others to come in and soak up a lot of tokens and then dump on the market. So that's one of the big factors here Doesn't necessarily apply to retail, but it would. It's good for the fact that you wouldn't, if you are a retail investor on a token, you don't get dumped on. And then there is a potential here for certification of certain digital assets. So this would provide a process for a blockchain or a digital asset to be certified as decentralized. So this gets into how you would get certified, quarterly basis to the SEC, commodity futures trading, depending on where you would fall. Further in this, treatment of custody activities as banking institution. This is where it gets a little bit dicey because this would prevent federal regulators from imposing requirements on state and federal financial institutions to record their balance sheets, a liability and a corresponding asset at fair value of the digital assets that they're safeguarding, simply meaning they don't have to account for what's happening, meaning state and federal agencies, institutions, finance institutions don't have to account for basically a balance sheet. So this, I feel like, plays into more of the banking industry with a lot of that gray market and kind of that very smushy way that the fiat system works. So I'm not sure I like that one either. Requires future commission merchants, FCMs, to hold customers' digital commodities in a qualified digital commodity custodians. So that would probably affect on who are those qualified custodians. Conflicts of interest, minimum capital requirements, and then reporting and record keeping. So it's funny that they would require all of those custodians to apply by good record keeping, but not financial institutions that are government. I don't know that this one is going to make its way through the House. Last up here, CFTC, SEC Joint Advisory Committee on Digital Assets. I mean, they've already shown that they don't work well together, so I'm not sure how that would ever occur. Further into this was study, this was interesting, study on non-fungible digital assets. The GAO must make a report publicly available again after 1 year on NFTs. Again, I don't think they can ever get to a point where they can actually agree on this. So anyway, the bill itself gets into a lot of detail. I'm going to highlight a couple of things. Definitions under the Securities Act. All right, so you get to earn the title of decentralized once that these kind of conditions are met. Previous 12-month period. You can't alter the functionality or operation of the blockchain system. Okay. And then during the previous 12, you can't do any digital asset issuer or affiliated person beneficially owned in the aggregate, 20% or more of the total amount. So scenario would be that a lot of these startups or the founders wouldn't be able to, scoop up a whole bunch of these tokens, more than 20% in this kind of scenario, which would again get back to DeFi. All right, so this is segregating money assets and property received from any customer, except that the money assets and the property of any customer. So now they're going to allow commingling. Interesting. So, and I'm guessing that this is done because of the issue that they face with the banking industry, because banking commingles funds. So maybe that's the framework they're trying to secure against the old fiat system, and that if fiat systems were to hold these assets at some point, they could commingle them. Basically, what you've got here is a bill that is very complicated, that's going to basically come in, I think, muddy the water a bit. It is a Republican bill, which is typical of Republicans, is to kind of protect these fiat elements that are in the system and also not really be accountable on the side of, just being able to do audits and trails and things of that nature for budgets. I thought that was a little bit of an overstep. It really is a scenario that I don't think this is going to go anywhere. So this is another one that will most likely absolutely fall. Now, what could happen, though, is that some things could be taken from this bill and added into, because remember, all of these guys are communicating with each other. Well, hey, if you do something, I'll do this for you. Bring this section of that bill into yours. There's a lot of that kind of communication happening right now and negotiation. Just so you remember, this is the one that I think is most important. The House vote on the crypto stablecoin bill, even though it was delayed, it's delayed a week. It's going to happen on July 26th. This is a very important date because if we get a stablecoin bill passed through the House, this will set up a massive impact on what I think the rest of the market is looking at, both from how the market may perform, but more importantly, how regulation may be accelerating into this year and definitely into 2024, even though it may be an election year and we'll see a lot of changes coming at it. So put some comments down below. And it's a good place for you guys to kind of jump in also on the Diamond Circle. That's where we do additional research. We send out additional content. We've got the Diamond Circle podcast over there that goes out every week. Lots more content that you can catch, and it's free. It's very easy. If you guys want to catch me, it's out there on Twitter, @Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.